Lane Dermott turned the key in the door of his mother's modest home in Mandeville, L.A. Walking into the foyer of his home, he threw his backpack to the floor, creating a loud thud as the heavy books contained within strike the hardwood floor.
Lane, what have I told you about throwing your books down like that? We just had the floors done. His mother, Nancy Dermott, scolds, unseen but most certainly heard, from the nearby kitchen.
"I'm pissed, Mom," Lane replies, voice laced with the sort of angst that only a teenager who feels slighted by society can produce. His mother lets out a patient sigh. "What happened now, Lane? Are those kids still giving you a hard time at lunch?" "No, I told you already I don't care about them." Lane's book of poetry, which also doubles as his journal, had recently been fished out of his backpack by some mean-spirited peer or another and shared with the rest of the school. He'd had some problems with bullying since then, but Nancy had sincerely believed it was starting to slow down. Kids can only stay focused on one thing for so long, in her opinion, and the expiration date on her son's latest abuse should, in her mind anyway, be nearing. She'd been raising Lane alone for some time now. Paul Dermott, her former husband and Lane's missing-in-action father, had been out of the picture for the last 4 years or so. Since then, she'd been doing her best to raise and support him, but Lane was not always an easy son to support. His obsession with what his mother thought of as dark things drove a divide between them. He was at an age where he felt she couldn't possibly understand him or his interests, and had quickly established that she was an outsider looking in. His room, adorned with strange books on the occult, disturbing art and posters for strange foreign horror films, caused her to avoid going in there unless absolutely necessary. She'd tried a time or two to explain to him that perhaps his interests in these disturbing pieces of culture are what caused him to become a target at his school. This, of course, only served to drive a deeper wedge between them, as he would insist that she didn't know or understand him. Now, on this otherwise lovely day in Mandeville, it would seem that Lane Dermott had found something new to be furious about. Nancy reached into her purse and fetched her favorite coping mechanism, her bottle of Xanax. "This sounds like a 2-pill problem," she thought to herself as she washed the medicine down her throat with a glass of tap water. Forcing a smile and resigning herself to play therapist, she proceeded.
"Come in here and tell me what happened," she called to him.
"This happened," her son replied, stomping into the kitchen and throwing 2 articles of literature on the breakfast table. "Mr. Kimball rejected my book report. He said that the subject matter was inappropriate." Nancy looked down at the table and saw the book report, neatly typed and placed into a document binder, and then observed the book that the report had been based upon. She quickly realized that she should have allowed the Xanax a bit more time to start working its euphoric magic before engaging her son. "Lane, that book is banned in schools, you know that? The school sent out letters informing everyone. Why would you do your report on that?"
"It's freedom of expression, Mom. Why can't any of you understand that?"
"You knew he was going to kick that report back, son. Why would you provoke the teacher?" Lane had 2 other book reports rejected by his English teacher over the last few months. The first had been based on the long-time banned The Anarchist Cookbook, while the other had been on a recently exiled piece of literature called Voodoo and Hoodoo, removed from schools because it allegedly gave step-by-step instructions on how to prepare and cast hexes. Now that the school had blacklisted yet another book, Nancy couldn't even feign shock that Lane had immediately picked it up. She didn't mind that he read the book. She didn't mind that he was interested in its content, but she knew that he intentionally wrote the report just for a reaction from the teacher. That couldn't be denied. Nancy picked up the small paperback, gazing at its dark cover. In stark white was the title. This book, an autobiography, hit the bookstores about 2 months ago. The residents of Mandeville, especially those in positions of power, were not pleased at the content found within the book's pages. Corruption, cover-ups, privileged families, money, abuse and murder were the main themes. Mandeville was made to look like a haven for the wealthy and a pit of inequity for those without it. Her former husband's name appeared a few times throughout. He'd been the Assistant Director of Internal Affairs for the Mandeville Police at the time, and the author of this book had not been kind to the authorities in his telling of the events from 4 summers ago back in 2015.
It's part of this town's history, Mom. Why is it okay for us to learn about all the other horrible events of our past, but I can't write about this? This story just hits too close to home for too many of us, Lane, Nancy stated. She was feeling her temper start to rise a bit, not just because her defiant son once again found a way to irritate his teacher, but because the events listed in the book in her hands had partially led to her husband leaving her and Lane behind.
Lane would have likely been shocked to learn that his mother had purchased a copy of the same book his rejected report had been based upon. Nancy, like so many other residents of Mandeville, had been deeply impacted by the actions of Jeffrey Woods. Following the brutal slaughter of his parents, Jeff Woods had gone on to kill 4 more people before he finally vanished for good. Nancy hadn't personally known any of the victims, but in a town as small as Mandeville, she'd at least walked past them once or twice at the grocery store or the park. After killing his parents, Jeff the killer targeted Officer Donald Williamson of the Mandeville Police Department. He'd been the officer who first investigated Jeff Woods for fighting with 3 other kids in the parking lot of the village shopping center. He'd also been involved in the investigation of the now infamous flare gun incident in Randy Hayden's garage. Lew Woods had the following to say about Williamson in his book. From Chapter 4, Corruption in Uniform is, never in my life would I have believed the corrupt, small-town cop archetype could exist in such a larger-than-life capacity. Donald Williamson, my brother's 3rd victim, embodied so much corruption that one would almost think him a work of poorly written fiction. The woman at the video store called the police about the fight, and it was none other than Williamson who was assigned to investigate.
He blamed my brother and I for the entire incident. He insisted that our failure to chain up our bikes somehow justified Randy, Keith and Troy taking them for a joyride. He said that the witnesses saw Jeff take the first swing at Troy.
Upon reviewing the police report that was made public long after the incident took place, it was revealed that only the video store clerk witnessed the event. Her statement indicated that she saw a group of boys fighting in the parking lot. At no time does it specify that my brother instigated the altercation. Williamson would later be called to investigate the fight at Randy's home, the injury with the flare gun, and the ultimate blinding and disfigurement inflicted upon my brother. It was reported that Jeff shot himself in the face with the flare gun. Williamson once again worked his skills at corruption. Rather than investigating the incident, he merely took Randy's statement. Paramedics on the scene later stepped forward and admitted that Williamson could be seen coaching Randy, Keith and Troy as they wrote their statements, practically feeding them their lines like a stage director in a play. The next victim my brother would take was likely the only truly innocent one to fall. Benny Rosenberg, chief editor of the NOLA Watch, had been contacted by Jeff about 2 weeks after the murder of Williamson. By this time, the photograph taken of Jeff by Williamson's son had made the national headlines. The picture, accompanied by USA Today labeling Jeff the Killer, had by now turned my brother into a national sensation. Questions were being asked now, and I have no doubt in my mind that Randy Hayden's father, along with officials in the Mandeville Police Department, were scrambling to keep many of the facts of the case hidden. The Mandeville police were only giving cookie-cutter answers, usually falling back on the excuse that all the facts would be revealed once the case was closed. No one close to the investigation would speak in any detail, and tough questions were often directed to the MPD. As Public Affairs Department, which somehow never seemed to have their telephones staffed. Phone messages were left unanswered, reporters were ignored, and everyone seemed to be in too much of a rush to stop and talk. The encounter between my brother and Rosenberg is one that is well documented now. The tape recording that Rosenberg had been using to conduct the interview returned to the Nola Watch about a week or so after Rosenberg's death. Monica Davenport, who'd been the assistant editor, released the tapes in her own news documentary, Jeff Woods, The Killer Speaks. The recordings, the only known testimonial by Jeff himself, tell of the real encounters with Randy and his friends. The tapes reveal how Williamson worked to whitewash the investigation and serve to cast further doubt on Randy's explanation of events with the flare gun. The tapes were released after the investigations in the MPD, and Maxwell Hayden had already begun to be looked into. However, they helped to shed light on other corrupt actions committed by Mandeville officials. Rosenberg's death, for example, was not made public for almost 24 hours. The police on scene claimed that they couldn't identify Rosenberg and had to conduct lab testing to uncover his identity. However, Monica Davenport, who'd actually contacted the police, testified that she'd given the 911 dispatcher Rosenberg's full name and had even explained why he was out in Mandeville that night. It is believed that due to Rosenberg's connection with my brother, the MPD were instructed to keep the matter quiet for as long as possible to protect the slowly recovering image of the town. The police did not want to have to admit that Jeff Woods was still on the loose 2 weeks after his last murder. There is also a darker conspiracy that I can only call such, because no further evidence was ever discovered. However, considering the tainted reputation and obvious corruption within Mandeville, it stands to mention anyway. According to one of the EMTs on scene, Rosenberg was still alive when the police first arrived. She believes that had the MPD acted immediately, Rosenberg could have survived his attack by Jeff. The official police report states that when officers arrived, they did not initially see Rosenberg's body due to the lack of streetlights in the area. They claim to have searched the exterior of the small building where Rosenberg and Jeff conducted their interview. Then the police officer on scene claimed to hesitate to enter the building until he was able to confirm with his watch commander whether or not a warrant would be needed to enter. Davenport lambasted the police on this, as the regulations clearly stated that entering a building without a warrant is lawful so long as the officers have suspicion that a crime has taken place inside said building. Furthermore, the door of the building was ajar at the time of the officers' arrival, and shining a flashlight into the door would have immediately revealed Rosenberg's body. Once the larger conspiracy began to become public knowledge, the rumors continued to evolve that the police didn't want Rosenberg to survive the injury due to the knowledge he'd gained from speaking to Jeff. They were not aware of the tape recording, and perhaps assumed that with Rosenberg dead, no further information about the Jeff murders could surface. Lew Woods's book catalogued the next victims in a similar fashion. Keith Jacobson and Troy Lockett were Jeff's next victims. This took place 2 weeks after the death of Williamson, and a night after the death of the journalist from New Orleans. Had the Mandeville police not worked so hard to keep the death of Benny Rosenberg quiet, perhaps Keith and Troy's parents could have done something to protect them. They would have at least known that Jeff was still in the area. However, with Rosenberg's death still not officially reported, the town was starting to relax again. Perhaps they all believed it was over with murder of Williamson. The double homicide took place at Keith Jacobson's home. Investigators believe that Jeff was able to gain entry into the house through an unlocked patio door. Keith was found brutally stabbed to death in the kitchen of his home. It is believed that Troy overheard the commotion and from the second floor of the home and was in the process of descending the stairs to investigate. His body was found at the base of the stairs, his death also caused by multiple stab wounds. Randy Hayden, who instigated violence in the encounter with Jeff and I at the video store, and who is also believed to have set up the attack on Jeff at his home, on the day of the flare gun injury, was the only one to escape Mandeville alive. His parents, Bridget and Maxwell Hayden, discovered that their wealth and influence could not protect their son from the ramifications of his actions. Randy Hayden and his family moved at once. A moving company was contracted to collect their belongings. It is believed that Randy Hayden and his parents went into witness protection. A moving company was hired to pack their home for them, as they were likely advised to avoid Mandeville until Jeff was captured. It was in fact the movers who would end up uncovering the massive cover-up and outright lies committed by Maxwell Hayden along with the Mandeville Police Department. Nancy felt her anger boil at this point. Before Jeff Woods and his family moved to Mandeville, she'd had a great life. Her husband, being a high-ranking member of the Mandeville Police, meant that she enjoyed a certain degree of comfort within the city limits. Speeding tickets did not exist in Nancy's vocabulary, nor did parking fines, or the need to always ensure that she was sober when driving. Most of the officers knew who her husband was, and if they didn't, they would learn soon enough should they decide to issue her any form of citation. She'd become accustomed to this, and therefore was not prepared for the public shaming that was soon to follow. The book went on, "I will never understand why those that commit crimes record them. Perhaps there is a foolish undertone within all criminal actions that compels the guilty to leave those little breadcrumbs. Perhaps it is simply hubris." Maxwell Hayden had in fact instructed his company's director of loss prevention to supervise the movers personally on each of the 3 days they were packing up the home. However, no one can be everywhere at once, and even under the watchful eye of Hayden's guard dog, the movers were able to strike gold. My personal belief is that the loss prevention associate was busy watching over the jewelry and other valuables. He likely never thought that the real buried treasure would be found in a simple, leather-bound day planner left in plain sight on Hayden's nightstand. According to the mover, he'd picked up the planner and stuffed it into his pocket so that he could pick up the nightstand and carry it out of the room. By his own admission, he had no interest in the book. However, upon returning to his home that night after a long day of moving furniture, the mover discovered he'd forgotten to remove the planner from his pocket. He stated that he tossed the small book on his coffee table and had forgotten about it for a few days. By the time he realized that he still was in possession of the planner, the move was completed and the truck carrying all of the Hayden family's possessions was on its way to wherever they'd gone to hide. The mover reported taking the planner to Hayden's office building and leaving it at the receptionist's desk. From there, the chain of custody is unknown, that is, until it appeared again in the hands of the local media. By the time the small day planner made its rounds, it had visited the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Louisiana State Justice Department, the Attorney General's office, and about half a dozen other organizations. The little day planner contained meetings and lunches scheduled between Maxwell Hayden and Paul Dermott, who at that time was the Assistant Director of Internal Affairs for the Mandeville Police Department. The meetings all took place after the initial fight between Randy and Jeff in the shopping center parking lot. Other members of the Mandeville Police were penciled in for lunch or dinner, including Donald Williamson himself. This sparked enough red flags for the powers that be that existed above or beyond Hayden's influence to dig deeper. By then, questions were already being whispered about anyway. The physician at the hospital, Dr. Reynaldo Diaz, had already demanded a complete ballistics report from the day of the flare gun incident. He did not believe, based on the angle of the wound across Jeff's face, that the injury could be self-inflicted. He'd informed authorities that he'd initially waited on filing the formal request for the report because he'd assumed the police would have further investigated Randy's questionable explanation on their own. It wasn't until he realized that wasn't going to happen that he'd taken it a step further. To accompany this allegation, Hayden's planner showed a lunch scheduled with the Mandeville Police Department's Director of Crime Scene Investigations, Lara Dubois. The MPD went on to deny Diaz's request for further information, instead assuring him that the matter was being fully investigated by their own personnel. Once the planner was thoroughly analyzed, the deluge of federal investigators fell on Mandeville like a plague of locusts. The MPD was gutted, with all of the top brass either resigning or being forced out. Many officials admitted to being bribed by Maxwell Hayden, while others attempted to claim they were blackmailed or pressured. Those that claimed pressure from above decided that a sacrificial lamb was in order, and Paul Dermott became said lamb. A picture was painted of Dermott and Hayden working side by side. Hayden's money combined with Dermott's position allowed them to play the city of Mandeville like a game of chess. However, the Dermott's lawyer did an impressive job of throwing just enough doubt at the grand jury that they were unable to decide if he was truly a mastermind or simply a patsy. No indictments were made, and Dermott quickly resigned his post and left Mandeville. His wife received divorce papers in the mail sometime shortly after he left the town. His excuse was he needed to start over from scratch and could not drag his family through the mud with him. "This destroyed us, you know that," Nancy suddenly shouted, causing her son to startle a bit in surprise. "Jeff Woods caused more problems for this city than I can count. That's why this book is banned at your school, because we want this forgotten. We don't want Jeff the Killer to be part of our history." Lane began to argue back, perhaps to point out some hypocritical notion that his mother or his teacher was falling victim to, but Nancy continued to rant, giving Lane no time to speak.
"Your father had to leave because of this, left us here to fend for ourselves. Max Hayden, that bastard, cut some sort of deal, testified against the city that he'd called home for so long. Now he's living a new life with a new name. His son is probably getting ready to start college with his secret identity, and he'll never have to face the consequences that you and I did, Lane."
And now, 4 years later, when the dust has finally settled just a bit, when people no longer look at me and see Paul Dermott's wife, when people no longer whisper about me when I turn down an aisle at the store, now this fucking book comes out. Everything that I've worked so hard to leave behind, now brought back to life for the world to gawk at once again. Nancy was crying now. Lane, trapped in that realm between the sympathy he felt for his mother and the anger that he still harbored for his book report being denied, simply exited the kitchen with no further commentary on the matter. He'd returned to his bedroom and took to the internet to voice his rage instead. He logged on to his Facebook profile and began a long rant about censorship, freedom of speech, corruption, and the hypocritical world that he was forced to exist within. He went into vivid detail about Lew Woods's book, about how Jeff the Killer was the only thing that put Mandeville, LA, on the map, about how his teacher was simply afraid of the truth, and so on it went. After Lane Dermott felt that his work in the field of exposing social injustice was done for the day, he collapsed on his bed and dozed off, still brooding over the unfair nature of life. Several hours later, he was awoken by a commotion from outside of his bedroom. The faded light coming in through the window told Lane that it was late in the evening. There was suddenly a loud crash, followed by what he thought just might be soft cries. The whimpering tone sounded as though it belonged to his mother. Lane stood from his bed and placed his ear to the door. He was now certain that the voice belonged to his mother. At first, he didn't react. Over the years since her husband left, she'd fallen into bouts of depression, and it was not too uncommon for her to suddenly begin to cry with no apparent provocation. The crashing sound, though, that was something new. It had been too loud to just be a simple plate falling and shattering, or a picture dropping from the wall. Slowly, Lane cracked the bedroom door open and could now hear his mother better. She wasn't just softly crying, but rather sounded as though she were begging.
Please don't hurt us. Please just leave."
Lane looked around his room for something, anything that could use to defend himself. However, it had gotten dark outside, and he didn't want to risk turning on his bedroom light and alerting whoever was terrifying his mother that he was back there. He didn't have a cellular phone or a landline in his